Today's conversation tackles a very uncomfortable, I would say, question, and which is urgent. The title of this event is "Are Progressives to Blame for Trump's Attacks on Universities?" It's a provocative question, and one that asks us to reflect not only on authoritarian tendencies of political leaders, but also on the role that institutions of higher education and those of us within them may have played in fueling public distrust. There are many more important questions to explore tonight. For instance, did universities allow political ideology to contaminate the project of open inquiry in the pursuit of knowledge and truth? So we are lucky to have Sasha Mad, who will be in conversation with Alexis Papazoglou to unpack these questions. Sasha Mad is a philosopher, writer, and columnist who explores the moral dilemmas at the heart of today's most pressing social issues. She is an associate professor at the Pontificia Universitat Católica de Chile and visiting professor at Southampton University. Alexis Papazoglou is managing editor of LSE, British Politics and Policy blog. He was previously senior editor at the Institute of Art and Ideas and has taught philosophy at Cambridge and Royal Holloway. He is also hosting these, the Philosopher and the News podcast for the Philosopher. And finally, before I invite the speakers to start this incredible, exciting conversation tonight, just for the format of the event, Alexis and Sasha will be in conversation for about 35-40 minutes. And then we will be asking questions in the Q&A part. And please put your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of this screen. Otherwise, we won't ask you a question. We only see the Q&A part. And you are welcome to, during the event, to put your comments and other ideas in the chat. And thank you, Alexis, and thank you, Sasha, for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining today. And welcome to the Philosopher and the News, Sasha.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Right. So our conversation today has a very explicit news hook, which is Trump's attack on Harvard University, which sort of started with a broader pressure on the institution after having done the same at Columbia, I think, to exercise a certain degree of control over who was allowed to teach, what were they allowed to teach. This was on the basis of claims that the university was giving refuge to anti-Semitic ideas and anti-Semitic people. That then has escalated into cutting off federal funds to the institution, attempting to stop foreign students from enrolling at Harvard, and so on and so forth. So these are the particulars in the kind of news hook, but this is part of a kind of wider attack that Trump has launched on universities, as well as a kind of broader set of values that we can see as originating and nurtured in academia, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, things like critical race theory, gender studies, woke ideas more broadly. So we should probably start this conversation with acknowledging a sort of political side of this, which is universities often find themselves on the wrong side of authoritarian or authoritarian curious regimes. So I'd like to start with this question. Do you think there's a case for saying that universities are sort of intrinsically incompatible with authoritarian regimes and governments?
It's an excellent question, and I'm excited to speak to that. Before I do, I just want to take one step backwards to address the title, the very provocative, slightly inflammatory title of our conversation. Are progressive, academics, responsible for Trump's attacks? on US universities? And the answer to that, of course, is no. Trump and his administration are responsible for those attacks. And the fantasy or the notion that if universities just behave in the right way, they're going to be able to escape that onslaught, I think is just that. It's a fantasy. I mean, if you look to the historical record, universities, insofar as they represent institutions devoted to the independent pursuit of truth and so on and so forth, tend to fall victim to, precisely these kinds of authoritarian assaults. So I don't want to suggest that if only left-wing progressives have behaved differently or behave differently from here forward, they're somehow going to be able to escape this much larger dynamic. But we can speak to that more.
Yes.
I think
we'll see what enables that attack, maybe,
right,
the kind of
exactly.
behaviors that enable it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I do think that left-wing progressives have unwittingly largely turned themselves into a soft target for the populist rage that then Trump and gang weaponize for their own authoritarian ends. So that's really the answer to the question posed in the title of our conversation. But I want to go now to the question you just asked, which is fantastic. You said, are universities sort of intrinsically incompatible with authoritarian governments? Well, in one sense, no, plenty of universities continue to function in one way or another in some attenuated form under authoritarian regimes. But I think the important point here is that universities ideally champion truth, the independent pursuit of truth, open inquiry, critical thinking, and these values do threaten the mechanisms by which authoritarian power is asserted, constructed, maintained. And it is these values that are fundamentally incompatible with, or better yet, fundamentally challenge authoritarianism. So, and here again, I think, a useful thing to add is just that in the context of an attempted authoritarian breakthrough, all independent institutions must be broken and brought to heel, ensuring that loyalty to the autocrat and his movement become the number one priority and value. But having said that, independent sources of knowledge, information, and truth are especially vulnerable to attack in these contexts, precisely because they stand in the way of the autocrat's propaganda campaign, namely his attempt to fabricate a parallel reality, often built on lies, and to force the rest of the country to live inside it. So truth and evidence become the enemy, and insofar as universities in particular stand for truth and evidence, they come in for a special kind of attack. So I would say just in that sense that Trump's attacks on universities fit this broader historical pattern, delegitimizing institutions that produce inconvenient truths, that insist on the importance of evidence and that kind of thing. And that, classically authoritarian regimes seek to undermine independent thought by controlling academic discourse. Lists of forbidden words, lists of forbidden research topics, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Although perhaps also worth adding, they don't always succeed in doing so, right? I mean, humanity has mostly functioned under weird forms of government that are not sort of liberal democratic, and yet, pursuit of knowledge has continued and flourished even under quite adverse conditions, political conditions.
Absolutely.
Let's go to this sort of question of, okay, yes, progressives are not to blame. We're not victim blaming here. But we want to address this kind of broader question of what are the phenomena in universities that sort of enabled a political movement that sort of resented in some ways universities and academics. And in your piece, you've written a piece about this in Prospect Magazine, where you're the philosopher at large, and you say that this attack on universities and DI, quote, both channels and fuels widespread resentment of the educated elites, end quote. And it immediately rang a bell to me, this kind of Richard Rorty passage from his book, Achieving Our Country, in 1990, late 1990s book, where he sort of diagnoses or worries about something similar happening, right? And he says that, people will turn against postmodernist professors and the college graduates that can be seen to be dictating polite manners or the right ways to speak to the rest of society. So Rorty has a very kind of economic, socioeconomic sort of diagnosis of why that might be. He's sort of it's part of this deindustrialization that's taking place and the threat of the blue collar sort of working class. In your piece, you sort of put the finger on a different source, and you call it groupthink, a groupthink of academics being largely to blame. Can you tell us, what do you have in mind? What kind of groupthink have academics been trapped inside of?
Yeah. Another great question. So I would say that elites, academic elites, are viewed as being involved in these kind of puritanical moral purges, where in the end almost no one is free of the moral stain of racism, of sexism, of ableism, et cetera, and so must be condemned. So they're on the hunt for the moral stain and to condemn, all who are contaminated with these kind of noxious views and ideologies. That said, the more we understand about the systemic, pervasive, and often unconscious nature of these isms, sexism, racism, etc., the more we see that everyone and everything is contaminated and must be condemned. And this makes, I think, for this ever-shrinking in-group of those who are seen as morally legitimate, as very academics who are doing the condemning, with everyone else left on the outside. And this, I think, very understandably leaves a lot of people feeling resentful, feeling angry, feeling looked down upon and excluded. And then Trump and co. then tap into those feelings to motivate a populist backlash against academic elites, against elites in general, but especially academic elites who are associated with this type of groupthink and these types of kind of moral purges. And I would say, it is real to a point that progressive academia does display a kind of intellectual tribalism. There's all kinds of factors that contribute to that. Just professionalization in general rewards, ever smaller communities that defend their disciplinary boundaries in particular ways and become ever more insular, right? There's just sociology of disciplines that teaches us a lot about how those kinds of mechanisms get going, whatever the content of the rewarded views then are. But anyway, I do think you see that kind of intellectual tribalism, rewarding conformity, the use of these kind of implicit moral purity tests. And then, of course, excessive ideological conformity, which that was not in anybody's plan, but that's the upshot of all of this. That kind of ideological conformity, that kind of conformism results in insularity, right? It results in kind of a suspicion toward differing views, a chilling effect whereby people are less willing to express, heterodox views. And then that kind of insularity, again, contributes, unfortunately, to this populist resentment, by reinforcing stereotypes of elitism and of exclusion. It's a complex phenomenon. There's a lot of factors here. Nobody wanted it to go this way. But I think there's a special irony because a lot of the discourse from the progressive left is anti-elitist, but a lot of the behavior is read as elitist, right? And so that just looks like a glaring hypocrisy that Trump and co. love to call out, right? That's kind of their favorite sport.
There's a bit of a paradox here, though, isn't there? In some ways, we talk about, academia being this sort of like insular, group that sort of gets deeper and deeper into the weeds of their topics and, carve smaller and smaller spaces about, which views are, acceptable and which views are not. And so in some ways you might say, well, why would people and why do people care about what academics do and write about in their ivory towers, and in their academic journals that no one reads? Why is it that sort of triggers a resentment of sorts? Because,
well, I think it triggers.
There's not much public contact with that world, as it were. Yeah.
Well, I think there's more public contact because of the way Trump has turned the liberal left-wing academic into a political target. Right. So many of his political campaign ads were making fun of the use of, there was that famous ad where, Kamala Harris is for they, them, Trump is for you. So there's a way in which he's turned this caricature of the left-wing academic into a public target of populist rage. So he's partly responsible for why people have taken an interest, right? He's ensured that they've taken an interest and a negative one. But I would also say that on these particular set of issues, I think people do feel moved, touched, and affected because these are really pressing social issues to do with inclusion, to do with opportunity, to do with access, to do with who gets a voice at the table and who is respected and who is frowned upon. So I think these are very sensitive, socially charged issues that go well beyond the academy. I think that insularity and, particle physics, you're right, it doesn't provoke, widespread populist backlash, but for a reason, right? So, but the topics at the heart of a lot of progressive humanist thinking tend to be topics that touch everyone.
Mm. And what do you think about the kind of discourse and policing of these kind of moral boundaries within the academy? So there's been this tendency, and you hinted at it in your piece, there's a tendency to sort of like rewrite the history of these canonical figures, look back at them and say, well, can we really still, read Kant because he had, peculiar views about X or Y? I think, Hegel often gets picked out here because of his racism, Nietzsche because of his misogyny. Is this discussion productive within the academy, or is that a sort of conversation that has led to a sort of not very productive conversation and not very interesting in terms of scholarship?
So again, an excellent set of questions there, and I think the answers are complex. One thing I would say is that I don't think it's wrong or unproductive for scholars to focus on, say, Nietzsche's misogyny or Hegel's racism, but I would say that it can be wrong and unproductive to focus exclusively on those things. And then there's the question of what you do with your intimate, detailed, well-substantiated knowledge of the racism and sexism, et cetera, of these canonical authors. To what use do you put that knowledge? So that's then kind of a separable question. So in my view, kind of one of the main things to say here is that we have so much to learn in general as humans from imperfect people and even from wicked people. So the project of deciding in advance that we will only value and learn from those who are morally exemplary in every respect or across every dimension, I think is misguided. Even further, the idea that there is in principle a priori nothing to learn from those who happen to be deeply morally flawed, racist or ableist or sexist, say, I think is wrong and also fosters a kind of closed-mindedness that is just not helpful. So having said all of that, I think understanding the deep moral flaws of these revered thinkers has its place, not with a view to canceling them or expunging them from the canon, but with a view to understanding their racism, their sexism, etc., and how it interacts with or fails to interact with the true and interesting and worthy things they might also have said and thought. And here I would just say that, you can take a thought like, all human beings have equal moral worth, or there's like an intrinsic moral dignity to human beings. You can take that thought and then acknowledge that that thought can be originated by, written down by a racist. It can be used for racist purposes. It can arise in the context of deeply racist cultures and institutions. But is the thought and its content reducible to any of that? It isn't. It's still worth engaging with. And for me, it's a true claim. I do believe that all people have equal moral worth. And the fact that that thought has been used in racist ways, was written and said by many racists, and again, arose during the Enlightenment in a specific, very racist cultural context, for me doesn't, obviate or kind of destroy the independent value of that thought.
Right? Yeah.
So, and here another distinction might be useful, which is to say that, you can take speech literally, where you're just, paying attention to kind of, the content, the abstract content of the thought or the idea that's being asserted. So you're taking speech literally kind of as a vehicle for seeking and asserting truth claims, or you can take speech as messaging, as a move in a power game or, move in a kind of power struggle. And I think the urge to cancel those whose views we hold to be morally abhorrent, or those whose views are morally abhorrent, treats speech largely as a move in a power game. And that's one legitimate way of understanding speech, but there's another more literal way of understanding it, right? And these things sit side by side, which is part of why these issues are not always easy to adjudicate. But just stepping back, I guess I would finish on this point. I mean, it's hard to finish. There's so many more things to say, but I would just add that I think examining and taking seriously wrong, bad ideas, including racist ideas, say, or sexist ideas, is a very important part of thinking freely and improving our own ideas. Bad ideas, on the whole, I think, shouldn't so much be canceled or deemed too dangerous to be heard, but should rather be defeated with argument, held up to the light of public scrutiny. There are some exceptions, of course, where the performative effects of the speech understood as a move in a power game are so clearly injurious to the campus community, say, that there really is a case there for kind of deplatforming or what have you. But I think the bar should be set quite high on that score, or higher than it often is. So yeah, in sum, I think it's legitimate and necessary to critically engage with historical thinkers' problematic views. But outright cancellation, I think, misunderstands the complexity of what we learn from our very flawed fellow human beings, right? Themselves, and also misreads kind of the benefits of engaging with their views to understand, ourselves, the world, et cetera, et cetera.
I want us to kind of move towards a sort of like meaty philosophical kind of questions around this. Not that this isn't a meaty philosophical question about what is a legitimate sort of form of inquiry. But before we do that, I just want to highlight one last sort of like quote directly from your piece and just ask a question around it. So there's a quite punchy quote, and I think you hinted at it already, and where you say that there is a significant gap that has emerged between progressive academics' self-perception as crusaders against privilege and oppression and how they are widely perceived from the outside, namely as agents and beneficiaries of the very elitist exclusion they decry, end quote. So this is, again, brings up a number of different questions, but one way to approach this is this really about ideas and the kind of ideas that academics have about, issues around race or gender or social justice, or is this also, to a large extent, a kind of social class issue that creates a clash between people that live in, university campuses and have a certain kind of middle class existence and other parts of society that don't really, come in contact as much with that world?
So in answer to your question, I think it's both of those things at the same time. And I acknowledge just the pure class-based dimension of this, absolutely. Again, going back to a point I was raising earlier, academics frequently come across as a group of people interested mainly in talking to themselves, because they are a group of people mainly interested in talking to themselves, for good or for ill. And I think, it's justifiable to a point. I also think it's lamentable. We could get into that.
We've both been to the Kant Society conferences and the Hegel
right.
Kant Society.
Right.
Uniformity sometimes a bit too much, but yeah.
Right. So they come across this group of people interested mainly in talking to themselves. And it's also a privileged group, of course. Wherever you come from originally, being engaged in higher learning is an immense privilege. So when you have a privileged group of people talking to itself about highly charged social issues that matter to everyone, and then you have that group dictating ever more stringent terms for inclusion in their conversation, always raising barriers to entry, that comes across as elites shoring up and defending their elite status or the elite exclusionary status of their particular activity. That's how it comes across, because in large measure, that's what it is. So the ironic
and also because I guess going to university is still largely a ticket to a sort of more middle class life in America, even though that might be ending somewhat.
No, absolutely, and that goes to kind of the tyranny of the meritocracy and this whole way in which higher education gets used to create and maintain kind of elite power structures in society. So again, the ironic thing is, that what matters most on paper for many progressive academic elites is precisely inclusion, social justice, social mobility, etc. So there's an irony there, right? Because again, the discourse is anti-elitist, the interests are oftentimes anti-elitist, but the practice is highly elitist. So again, it's just this flaming hypocrisy that gets so easily called out by the other side and turned into a political target. But, having said all of that, I do think resentment towards academics is very much rooted. I mean, it's multifactorial, of course, but it's very much rooted in real class and socioeconomic barriers, right? The material reality of those exclusions, which are real. It's not just a matter of perception. And that there is a tyranny of meritocracy in American life. So I think, again, the perceptions of elitism and exclusion are grounded in these very real social forces. That said, again, progressives, I think, just play into it in an unfortunate way when they underestimate how elitist their practices come across. And why do they underestimate that? Because they have become very out of touch for all the kinds of in-group, dynamics that we've been describing. They have become very out of touch with what they sound like from the outside. So so in that way, they can end up alienating those very people or those very groups that they aim to support, with these kind of terminological innovations, Latinx instead of, Latina or Latino, et cetera, et cetera. That's another example that I used in the piece that we've referenced a couple of times.
Okay, now...
yeah.
Sorry, do you want to add something?
Well, I was going to add that I do think it's interesting that the left has been very interested in exclusion and oppression of certain kinds, like based on social identity, like race and gender, two prominent examples. But it seems to have lost sight to a certain extent of class-based exclusion as such, which is a kind of oppression which cuts across those earlier identitarian categories. So again, and we saw working class people of all backgrounds, right, and all genders move rightward toward Trump. So that's also very interesting.
Or political or exclusion on the basis of political beliefs, and maybe we'll come to that towards the end, and sort of the way that academia might be policing that too. I think there's a sort of really interesting and meaty philosophical question behind all of this, which again is multi-layered and has lots of questions of its own, but in some ways a very charitable interpretation of what Trump's attack on universities is saying, well, politics has contaminated, this practice of science and research. People with certain views are pushing forward an agenda that is informed by politics and values that have nothing to do with, this kind of idealized neutral search for knowledge and all the rest of it. So that to me brings up this question of the fact-value distinction that we talk about in philosophy, whether it's possible to completely separate what purports to be a description of the world, aiming to get at the truth, from values which don't have that kind of descriptive purpose, and whether, bringing it to the political, whether you can really separate politics from science. I think this was a question that got animated quite a bit during the COVID pandemic and has gone a little bit more mainstream than maybe we would expect. A few years ago, the New York Times did a whole episode on this question of politics free science. Is it possible? So what do you think about this? Do you think that part of the reason that people are mad at universities is that they think there is a moral and political agenda guiding the work that universities do?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's really good. That is very rich. There's so many entries into that one. I guess I would begin by saying that, just to clarify, Trump's framing of attacks on universities as attempts to remove political bias from science and research is largely disingenuous.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
Probably goes without saying.
Yeah.
So the goal is much less about purity of knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge than just reshaping institutional power dynamics to favor conservative, nationalistic, MAGA values. We can talk more about that in a minute. But just backing up a step to get to kind of the bigger philosophical question you're raising, I mean, I don't think that value-free science is a possibility. It doesn't exist in my view, and nor should we want it to exist. But the question of which moral and political values guide science research and how they guide it matters a lot. If, for example, equity and inclusion are values for us, things we value, then, for example, we'll want biomedical research that looks, at how a certain drug affects the health of all different social groups and not just how it affects the health of white men, say, and we could multiply the examples here. So no complete value-free science or philosophy, and nor should we want that, I don't think. Values shape research questions, methods, interpretations, but recognizing those inevitable value influences is really crucial, and managing them and scholarly transparency around those issues is really important to managing bias, to retaining kind of intellectual integrity, basically. So having said all of that, state-imposed values, right? State-imposed ideologies that are meant to guide and shape research, from the lists of forbidden words now, forbidden research topics, types of people that cannot be hired, right? That interferes very fundamentally with academic autonomy and independence and kind of leads to the ruination of a free society, in my view. So even if the left, not through any explicit political project, has drifted into certain kinds of ideological groupthink and conformism, that's really not on a par with the state trying to impose, right, from its position of power, a specific ideological agenda on the university. Right? These things have certain similarities, but they're also fundamentally different.
Okay, so we're keeping from that yes, sort of like including philosophical inquiry, I take it, right? So what kinds of questions people are interested in, how they approach a topic. Are you interested in equality or pluralism, social justice, or, I don't know, hierarchies of moral order, whatever it is, will always be somewhat influenced by people's background beliefs, whether implicit or explicit. Sometimes I imagine people are not, conscious of the values that are guiding part of their research. But I guess the question then is, if that is true, and if we agree that also universities have become, maybe through natural selection of sorts, places where a certain group of values kind of dominate and other values are less represented. And since a lot of these institutions are publicly funded, why is it not the state's position to come in and say, no, you need to correct this, and this is an adjustment? I mean, I'm not saying, again, that Trump's way of doing it is legitimate, but is there a space there to say that, well, when a public institution moves in that direction, then there has to be a kind of, or the state has at least the right to try and correct that?
Well, the question is kind of, what do we mean? What are the mechanisms? What are the appropriate mechanisms by which that kind of bias is corrected? And in my view, the appropriate mechanisms are like free, independent, unconstrained, critical discussion of the values that shape science, research and teaching institutions.
Does that not exist now? Is there not a free discussion of ideas at universities at the moment?
I think that that kind of freedom is an ideal, and different institutions at different times are approximating to that ideal more or less, depending on a huge number of factors, right? And as we've been talking about, the left's own groupthink has brought universities further away from that ideal than we would like. At the same time, this top-down, autocratic, state-enforced attempt to impose an ideology on institutions is certainly bringing us even further from that ideal. But then you have very rich and interesting questions about how do you foster a genuine culture of critical, open thinking and diversity of debate at universities and in society more generally, right? And that's just a multi-pronged, complex social cultural project. And I don't think state control has any place in it. That's to say, I really believe in the principle of like academic autonomy and independence, right? But then I think, okay, and what should, universities in a free society be aiming to do? Well, foster the very kind of debate we've been talking about. And it's hard to do for all kinds of reasons. And it's even harder to do in polarized political environments like the one we live in now, right? Which make that kind of free, critical debate and open-mindedness very hard. Open-mindedness becomes extremely hard in a polarized environment.
But as we know, I mean, from the kind of debate that has taken place over the years and on the left side of this, open-mindedness itself only gets you that far, right? In the end, you do need to get people from certain backgrounds with different kinds of experiences, with different beliefs, around the table. It can't just be the same people being like, okay, I'm just going to try and be a bit more open-minded in the future than I have been in the past.
Right.
So, I mean, this is obviously a sort of like slightly paradoxical and absurd idea, but given the attack that Trump has launched against diversity and all the rest, all those values, equity and inclusion, but are universities suffering from not having done DEI when it comes to, hiring more people from, with conservative agendas or conservative research projects or political views that don't find themselves in a natural place in most kind of liberal universities?
Right. Well, so that, I think it's a very provocative and interesting question. And I'm sort of working out a more principled version of my own answer to it. But what I would want to say to that is that affirmative action for ideological viewpoints is never going to make sense because it is antithetical to free critical thought. Like, imagine you're hired because you're a right-wing person, and now, your job depends on you having a certain set of views. right? Or you're brought in. So affirmative action based on social identity, right, which is kind of unchangeable. You're Black, or you're a female, or you're disabled, or you're queer, or whatever, makes a kind of sense to me. And again, I view affirmative action as kind of a, the lesser of evils. Like that's not the end game. That's a means take to get to an ideal, a better place where that's no longer needed, right? It's a redress for past wrongs, and it's all that kind of thing. So affirmative action on to do with social identity, for me, there is a case to be made there, absolutely. But based on ideological views, which should be changeable. Again, going back to what's the point of free critical debate ideally in a free society? Well, it's that people are allowed to, and indeed encouraged to, change their minds, to learn from others, right? But you're hired because you had a certain set of views, so that's
well. I mean, when people are hired for a certain research project, if they change a research project, they don't usually get fired as a result. Universities hire people because they have interests that they do at the time, and then they're always free to change those interests. Yeah.
But I think it would disincentivize that type of kind of learning and flexibility if you were to have something like affirmative for viewpoints. However, there is a real social challenge as to how to get more conservative viewpoints on campuses and into elite intellectual spaces. I'm not sure that affirmative action would be the best way to go about it.
Well, do you have any ideas about how people might go about that? I mean, is even that the solution? I mean, I'm not, maybe that's a silly idea that, universities have if they just hired more conservative people, then, the half of the population wouldn't resent universities and academics and wouldn't allow administrations to, do the things that the Trump administration is doing now, which is, properly threatening, the advancement of human knowledge in some of the kind of world's leading institutions, sometimes on areas that are completely unrelated to politics, as journalists have highlighted in these areas, all sorts of kind of research projects which are purely medical or looking at biodiversity, which has nothing to do with the kind of politically laden diversity that Trump is.
Yeah, no, and I agree with kind of the skeptical note you're sounding now, because I agree that, just kind of making universities the best version of themselves in this present cultural political moment is one question, but is that going to be a solution to, this kind of authoritarian nightmare that we're living through, or this attempted authoritarian breakthrough, or however you want to characterize? I don't think it is, any kind of direct solution to our problems. The solution to our present problems are longer term and more complex, which is not to say they don't require urgent action now. They do, but yeah, I mean, and also when you think about what Trump's aim of reshaping universities according to kind of MAGA values, what does that really amount to? I mean, what is the content of that ideological project? And there again, there's a lot of there's no clear consensus on that point, but if you just focus, for example, on his rhetoric and the rhetoric coming out of his administration, it's about reinstating traditional hierarchies where men over women, whites over Blacks or people of color, straights over gays, citizens over foreigners, the Christian faith over every other kind of faith, and most of all, MAGA adherents or Trump loyalists over everyone else, right? So this is a set of values that is pretty inimical to the project of searching for knowledge, of searching for truth and generating knowledge and new kind of technological breakthroughs, right? So it's really hard to see how kind of reinstating that set of values is actually at all compatible with the core mission of universities, especially in a free society.
And again, I mean, even beyond these sort of politically laden values that MAGA brings, I mean, when it comes to things like, research into vaccines and reopening this question of like whether vaccines cause autism and things like that, this is also, a politically motivated in some bizarre way project.
It is
you
very
know, which you know has been in some way settled, but
right.
probably
And
not in the right way. I don't know whether, you know, again, there's a sort of responsibility of communication from academia or from the medical institutions when it comes to these things, and how, you know, the worries of people or the concerns of people were taken seriously and included. But I don't know. Again, this points to a kind of different direction, which is sort of democratic science and that sort of more inclusive way of doing research, which doesn't only include experts in their field, but tries to kind of bring a selection of the citizens in the conversation, and a different set of views in the conversation.
No, I think democratic science is such an important goal, such a challenging one to achieve, especially kind of in our present moment. I think we always need to be working towards that, and yet it's made very, very difficult, you know, in the present circumstances by the fact that, you know, elevating cranks and quacks and conspiracy theorists is kind of the MAGA way of trying to address those concerns, right? Which ends up just destroying the science and then not necessarily making it, you know, genuinely more democratic and inclusive in the way we might hope, right? So I mean, you know, you look at the elevation of, Robert Kennedy Jr. to, you know, Health and Human Services. And again, that just feels like a political move more than anything to, you know, whatever the academic consensus is, we will find the person who smashes it and represents the antithesis. And that is meant to somehow satisfy this populist sense that, you know, the scientists have got it all wrong and they only serve themselves, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that, Sasha. Should we open to Q&A and then take it from there? So Bill Usman is asking, well, it starts with an observation. He says, just now on social media, I saw one left-wing academic going after another left-wing writer because supposedly the latter didn't use the exact right word in the title of their book about Gaza. Both are critics of Israel and advocates for Palestine. How can we ever form effective coalitions if we continue with that sort of infighting?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that question. But I feel as troubled by those kinds of dynamics as the writer does. I think the left has kind of lost capacity for coalition forming in recent years, recent decades. And part of that is due to the new media landscape. You know, we're all in these kind of echo chambers and bubbles, and, you know, groupthink is all the time reinforced due to the algorithm, right? Because it pays to reinforce groupthink, and that's what all of these social media companies soon learned.
I found out, yeah.
Right. So that's part of it. But so, yeah, we have real challenges there. And I also do think coalition building became harder because we became so fascinated and so interested in social identity and in difference and the need to always elevate and foreground and prioritize difference, that any appeal to sameness it became suspect. But you've got to appeal to sameness to form coalitions, right? Sameness that cuts across difference. And so I think the left became very uncomfortable with talking and thinking about sameness, like, oh, that if it's homogenizing, then some kind of, you know, particularity is going to be erased and left out, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's a deep and interesting story to tell there too, but it's multifactorial, and I agree that the problem is grave.
George Gonzalez has another kind of observation. It says, to what extent are attacks on universities attacks on young people who are totally alienated from the establishment? Who are alienated? Do you think we can frame Trump's attack on universities in a sort of like generation war, or does that not quite map out, given I don't know, Trump had quite a big support from a younger kind of, especially male audience?
I'm not seeing exactly how that would cash out. It'd be interesting to hear more from the person who made that comment. You know, I think that Trump wants the biggest audience, the most power, and the biggest platform possible at all times, right? So he's going for the crowd kind of at every moment. And I don't see him. But again, he feels like dispensing with elites and trashing them and, owning the libs and whatever is his best and fastest ticket to this growing populist coalition that he has going. But that includes the young, shockingly, a lot of young people, exactly as you point out, Alexis, moved Trumpward in the last election.
Okay, a different question, a sort of slightly challenging part of our narrative. So Carl Olson says, Trump's minions are opposed to data gathering in medicine, social outcomes, etc. That opposition is itself political, but having worked in universities for 35 years, I feel that the idea that progressives control higher education is like the claim that US media is liberal and potentially not true. And she ends by saying universities value the continuation of capitalism and the maintenance of the social order. And this goes a little bit, touches on this point that we made earlier, that universities are also these kind of class reproduction machines, no matter what the values of the professors and the research. Ultimately, this is a way of maintaining a middle class. So, are we wrong to think of that being the reason?
I would say that both those things are true at once, in the sense that, university system and universities in particular are very bought into capitalism, very, on the whole, very bought into kind of, in many respects, maintaining the status quo. But I don't want to paint with too broad a brush there, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But at the same time, I just think the evidence does bear out the fact that progressives and kind of left-wing ideological positions are overrepresented in at least in the US academy in general. Not across the board and not in every case and not in every department, but on the whole, I think the numbers do bear that out, which is part of why Trump can mount these attacks against progressives so often framed in terms of attacks on higher ed. So both of the things go together. But then you might want to ask the question of, well, why have progressives allowed themselves to become so capitalist or so bought into capitalist ideology in general? Again, not that everyone has, and there's plenty of, Marx is currently undergoing kind of a revival and a heyday and all of that kind of thing. But, the system certainly continue, the university system certainly doesn't challenge kind of the capitalist paradigm in a meaningful way in this moment. But this, I want to go back to this point because at least, and I think this is true also to an extent in the UK, but American colleges and universities have historically played a very important political role in driving social change, from the civil rights movement to the Vietnam War protests. And again, I think that, student activism around Gaza, peaceful protests around Gaza, again, exemplifies like very responsible political engagement that should be supported and not repressed on campuses. So while I do think, the university system is in bed with capitalism in ways that are problematic and require scrutiny and require change in the end, I also don't want to underplay the fact that universities have been and do continue to be drivers of real social change. Yeah. Especially student-led protests. So, yeah.
Maybe the next question can shed some light. Perhaps I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Ismail Oz wonders whether the reason why academics in English-speaking countries have seemed to be cut off from the rest of the population has something to do with tuition fees. And so in Europe, as Ismail points out, universities are mostly free or almost free. Most people have access to higher education depending on the educational system. That's not always true, in terms of selection, but finance doesn't seem to be an issue there. Do you think that also plays a role in seeing these institutions as elitist? Especially in America, the tuition fees of the leading universities are completely absurd these days.
Mind-boggling. No, it plays a huge role. It plays a huge, toxic, unfortunate role. No, and the whole system is broken in that respect, as is our healthcare system. The rich, get a fantastic world-leading education and they get fantastic world-leading healthcare. And the vast majority of the country is left out of all of that. More than 60% of US adults do not have a college education. And a huge part of why is because it's priced out of reach. So again, and then that speaks to some of the social factors, Alexis, that you were getting to earlier with the collapse of manufacturing and the collapse of traditional middle class economic prospects. So yeah, it connects to these much bigger social economic problems.
So John has a question. In relation to prioritizing autonomy of academic institutions, it reminds me of the debate of autonomy of the public sector, which must be balanced with public accountability. So this is a question about whether universities are open to a form of accountability and what that means. So what are the trade-offs between having this autonomy, which is also semi-autonomous, right? Because we've also now discovered, I wasn't really aware that these institutions like Harvard, which are incredibly rich, were so reliant on public funds as well, to the tune of billions. Yeah. Where does the accountability side come towards the public if these institutions are to some extent publicly funded?
Well, I do think that public accountability is very important, and you're spending taxpayer dollars. That's what it means. Those billions, come from real working Americans who pay their taxes. So yes, I do think accountability is very important, but mechanisms of accountability, have to be appropriate. And I'm not enough of a policy expert on these matters to really say something interesting about that. It's just that, under the banner of accountability, to a point, not that they're using that term, we're now seeing this kind of, autocratic, ideologically driven attack on universities under the banner of accountability, right, to a point. And that's what's so troubling. But genuine and real and appropriate mechanisms of accountability, both for specific institutions, but also sector-wide, is hugely important. But that's also why there's research standards and, there's there are mechanisms of accountability in place. Could they be improved? Yes. And that's, again, where universities, what they need is reform, not to be taken over by the US government, and certainly not under the present leadership.
Mm-hmm. I think Joanna Fisher's question is something that we've sort of touched upon in the kind of issue of how economics can contaminate the nature of universities and this kind of sort of culture of learning. I think I'd like to go to Nick's question first and then see if we have more time. So Nick asked a sort of broader question, and I think that it's an interesting one because we frame this so far as the kind of attack on universities and institutions. But Nick says there is also a kind of broader anti-intellectualism taking place here. And he says the apex of anti-intellectualism seems to me to have happened during China's Cultural Revolution. Are there lessons to be learned from that experience? How to avoid it? How did that anti-intellectualism die out in China? What are your thoughts? I mean, maybe you don't have kind of specialist historical knowledge on how it played out in China, but
right.
There is this broader issue, which again is not untypical of authoritarian regimes, which is that there's a sort of broader anti-intellectualism. Novelists might be under attack, or the arts, not just sort of university professors, as it were.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I agree that this anti-intellectualist strand is a very important part of the current dynamic that we're seeing. And when I was kind of giving that list of, what are they actually fighting for? What is the content of this kind of revaluation of values, or this value inversion that they want to install? And I said, whites over blacks, men over women, straight over gay, etc. And I should have included, heart or gut over head. Because I think that is a hugely important part of all of this. And partly because when you think about liberalism and what it is and what it stands for, it's a tremendously intellectual project. You have a very abstract notion of the individual as a bearer of rights. You put a huge amount of store in the rule of law. there's so much of liberal society and its understanding of what matters that rests on, intellectual hard work. And if you go to the instinct and to the gut and what feels right, this is very often, of course, how Trump frames his decision making, quite proudly. And he's very proud about his anti-intellectualism, as we know.
I love the uneducated, right? What was that?
Yeah, I love the uneducated, and people ask, like, well, have you analyzed the problem? Have you, did you consult with your advisors? No, it's what he felt was the right thing to do, and people love that and they cheer. So again, I think that's part of this inversion, this kind of, fuck you, if you will, to liberalism, that is like heart or gut over head, because we're too driven by ideas, we're too driven by abstractions. And this, again, is part of the whole mythology of returning to blood and soil and these kind of primordial forces.
Politics of instincts, of primordial instincts.
Of primordial instincts, that precedes, right, the fruit of reason and of kind of intellectual work and labor.
And of course, that also goes way back to sort of Plato and the way that he portrays politics as kind of different politics corresponding to different parts of the soul in his context, right? The appetitive versus the more reflective parts and the different politics that it sort of
that each
reflects.
One, right, absolutely. Yeah, you can, and I think, describing what we're living through now as a kind of, a reversion to, or an attempted reversion to, kind of the politics of pure appetite it's a useful characterization. And of course, appetite has the politics of appetite especially has a very close link to the politics of unconstrained and lawless violence, which again is a big part of what we're seeing now in the US in ways that, as we all know, are kind of quite unprecedented in recent history.
One last question, Joanna. Since you had two questions, I'm focusing on the second part here. Is a question about the role that the university, the emphasis on the sciences in the context of universities has played or plays in all this. Can we say something about how this privileging of natural science or social science sometimes over the humanities has contributed both to the picture that people have of universities and what they're about, but also maybe the public role of universities and how they're appreciated? I don't know. Any thoughts here on that aspect of the modern university, which has modeled itself more in that direction, and
right,
and even when there are humanities, they are always trying to emulate science in some ways, have research projects, funding grants, publish academic papers rather than books, all that stuff.
Oh, it's such a good and complex question. I almost don't know where to begin, and it's our last question. And it takes us away as well from some of the kind of key themes we've been thinking about, but in our conversation. But I would say that part of what is interesting is how how important the humanities are, especially in this moment, to defending the role of universities in free societies, as opposed and the role of universities in resisting kind of autocratic power. I think a lot of the emphasis on the sciences, historically there's such a rich story to tell there, but a lot of it, stems from or is related to this notion of universities as being in service of the economy, right? Get people jobs. They are there to help, increase GDP, right? Universities as kind of profit seeking and generating institutions. They are that, of course, but that being their kind of sole or core mission. And then the notion of what the humanities do and what the humanities are for is very orthogonal to profit, right? It's about the kind of people we are and we want to be. It's about how you cultivate free people, right? And these are questions that are quite orthogonal to how much money you make, either for yourself or how much, you contribute to society in monetary terms. So I think, again, when this goes back to an earlier question about how the university system, is kind of beholden to capitalist ideology in various ways. And I think the kind of the overemphasis or kind of celebration of the sciences and links into that, because it's a view of the universities as being essentially geared toward profit. instead of being essentially geared toward the cultivation of virtue or good citizens, free beings, free thinkers, the kind of people who are fit to inhabit and maintain a free republic.
Yeah, I guess behind all this conversation is the question: what are universities for? What is the purpose of a university for? Maybe for another time.
another podcast. Yeah.
Sasha, Ahmad, thank you very much for this conversation. I think it was very urgent, and we touched upon a number of big philosophical questions behind it. Thank you to everyone for attending and for your questions. Thank you, Mariam, for hosting. This is the last Philosopher live event of this season. We're taking a little summer break, and then we'll regroup in September. The Philosopher in the News, I hope, will have 2 more summer episodes, but they will be audio only, so look out for them in your podcast feeds. And hope to see you all back again in the new academic year or in September.
Thank you, Alexis. Thanks to everyone for being here. I had a great time. Really an excellent conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.